Here's a riddle for you. Why did Donald Trump pardon Juan Orlando Hernández, the former president of Honduras? A man convicted in the United States of America of trafficking massive quantities of cocaine into the United States of America. A man whose government was described by U.S. prosecutors as a narco state. On the eve of Donald Trump trying to go to war with Venezuela for being a narco state and bringing drugs into the United States of America, he pardoned the head of a narco state who brought tons of drugs into the United States of America. It doesn't make any sense. It's a riddle. Well, I have an answer to the riddle, and I'd like to share it with you. I propose it is because powerful oligarchs want to end democracy. Okay, hold on. I see you reaching for that skip button. Let me make a case, because I think it's a pretty good one. I've brought the receipts. They're kind of long receipts. They're Rite Aid-esque in their length, but everything's been researched, and this is what I think. So I think it all has to do with Zetas. What are Zetas? Zetas stand for Zones of Employment and Economic Development, which, as near as I could tell, should mean that they're called ZEEDs, but for whatever reason, they're called Zetas. And these are not special economic zones like you might see in China, where capitalism is allowed to operate inside a limited framework of state control. No, Zetas are private cities. Inside a Zeta, the normal rules of whatever country might be hosting a Zeta, they don't apply. There's no democratic governance, no voting. The courts of the country that is hosting the Zeta, they have no jurisdiction, nor does the constitution of that host country. The Zeta is completely governed and policed by the corporation that runs the Zeta. This is not capitalism. This is just sovereignty for sale. I mean, we've all heard of company towns. They had them at the turn of the last century, where a giant company would buy an entire town, buy the store. They would even have company cash that you had to spend at that store. Well, these are not company towns. These are company countries. They also happen to be libertarian wet dreams. Your crazy libertarian uncle, this is the thing he's been talking about the entire time. And more importantly, these Zetas are the beta tests for the ideas of tech philosopher and guru to the broligarchs, Curtis Yarvin. So Curtis Yarvin is quite the celebrity with the Silicon Valley types, and he is explicitly anti-democracy. In fact, he calls himself a neo-monarchist. But what he actually is proposing is more of corporate authoritarianism. He proposes a system where we break up countries. We don't need them anymore. Nationalism, it's from the past. It serves no purpose anymore. What we have is zones built around companies and commerce with the CEO at the top. And this is not fringe. As I said, Yarvin has devoted followers such as Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, and a guy you might remember as being one old man's heart attack away from controlling the entire world, J.D. Vance. And by the way, Yarvin's ideas, they're not theoretical anymore, because these so-called libertarian paradises, they already existed, and they were in Honduras under Juan Orlando Hernández. In fact, first thing he had to do when he got into office was have a coup against the Supreme Court, who had already ruled the Zetas unconstitutional. So first thing he did was he got rid of 4 of the magistrates and put in his people. So now with the courts out of the way, the Zetas were good to go. And they were upheld by the now corrupt Supreme Court that Hernández controlled. And they were protected through constitutional maneuvers that Hernández was able to push through. And by the way, as the oligarchs were carving up Honduras into their little libertarian paradises, Hernández obviously was the most prolific cocaine dealer on earth. But unfortunately, when Xiomara Castro was elected in 2021 to become the president of Honduras, one of the first major acts she did was dismantling the Zetas. Why? Because Zetas had become a symbol of corruption. The country didn't want them. They represented elite capture, loss of sovereignty, foreign control. Their whole country had been carved up and sold off. And so the Zetas had to be dismantled. No more sovereign CEO. No more private courts. No more private police force. So what did Peter Thiel and the other oligarchs who were invested in the Zetas of Honduras do? They came after Honduras and they sued. They sued for 1/3 of the country's GDP. Enough money for a poor country like Honduras to bankrupt the country. And with destabilization comes the possibility of another coup. A coup that could possibly bring back one Mr. Juan Orlando Hernández. But there was a little problem. he was sitting in an American jail cell. Let's talk a little bit more about Peter Thiel and his Zeta in Honduras, where he was the unquestioned leader of his own little country. And he called his little country Prospera because libertarianism. And Thiel is a major figure in the libertarian and post-liberal political thought movement. He's a vocal critic of democracy as it currently exists. And he got his start as a member of what was colloquially known as the PayPal Mafia, along with his buddy Elon Musk. Now, both these dudes pretty much grew up in South Africa, a society where white elites like them held power without democracy. And then when democracy arrived in South Africa, they lost their little points of privilege. So here's a question I'd like to ask Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. When democracy came to South Africa and the whites lost their privileged position, did they blame apartheid or did they blame democracy? I'd be curious what their answer is. Peter Thiel currently owns Palantir, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, which is a company whose platforms are used to integrate, analyze, and visualize massive data sets for governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and corporations, of course. And critics argue that Palantir enables mass surveillance with very little democratic oversight. And those critiques kind of hit a little bit harder when you think about the fact that the owner of Palantir has said that freedom and democracy are not compatible. Yeah, he has said that. Freedom and democracy are not compatible. So what else, in addition to PayPal, Zetas, and Palantir, has Peter Thiel invested in? Well, he's invested in a totally different kind of artificial intelligence. He's invested in J.D. Vance, the most artificial intelligence I've ever come across. J.D. Vance says he met Peter Thiel when he was at Yale Law School. He became enamored with him. Peter Thiel began mentoring him. He introduced him to elite networks, and he got him jobs. In fact, some of the jobs he got J.D. Vance, seems like J.D. Vance either wasn't qualified for or didn't do much there. It's almost as if he was just accruing wealth. Then, when J.D. Vance decided to run for Senate, and he was quite the outsider and had little chance of winning, Peter Thiel gave him the most amount of money any single donor has ever donated to a Senate campaign in the history of America. And he pushed him over the finish line, and J.D. Vance became a sitting U.S. Senator. But there's one problem. While running for Senate, J.D. Vance said he was a never-Trumper. J.D. Vance said Donald Trump could possibly become America's Hitler. Well, this is going to be a problem because Donald Trump was running for re-election in 2024. And it was Peter Thiel who put the first meeting with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump together at Mar-a-Lago. And he turned J.D. Vance from a Trump critic to a Trump loyalist. But here's a question. What did Donald Trump get out of it? Surely he doesn't just like hanging out with chubby dudes that wear eyeliner. He must have gotten something out of it. He's the most transactional president in American history. Donald Trump gets something out of everything. What did Peter Thiel and possibly Elon Musk offer to Donald Trump to get him to take J.D. Vance as his vice president? It's a good question. So let's get back to Curtis Yarvin and his vision for the 21st century, in which countries no longer exist. Everything's broken down into smaller zones controlled by CEOs. Well, Yarvin himself has said that in order to start implementing this, the first place you'll have to go will be someplace with weak institutions, high inequality, limited legal resources, and Honduras fit that bill perfectly. So bringing it back to Donald Trump. Do I think Donald Trump is a devotee of Curtis Yarvin? No, I do not. I don't think he reads anything, and certainly not political philosophy. I don't think Donald Trump has that much power. In fact, I think the reason he wants to build a ballroom and the Arc de Trump, and he sits on the board at the Kennedy Center, and he's redecorating the White House, I think that's all just evidence of busy work that you give to the figurehead while other people are actually pulling the strings. And I think Peter Thiel came to Donald Trump, and just like Don Corleone in The Godfather, he said, there will be a day that I'll come and ask for a favor. And this was that favor. I want you to pardon Juan Orlando Hernández. This to date is the only answer to the riddle of why Donald Trump pardoned Juan Orlando Hernández that makes any sense to me. We'll see if I'm right. We'll keep an eye on it. We'll keep an eye on Honduras. We'll keep an eye on President Castro. We know that Donald Trump is trying to destabilize Venezuela right now for the oil. Let's see if he tries to destabilize Honduras next for the oligarchs.